Hello, this is In the Back Room with Mr. Shank,
And Mr. Woods.
and today we're talking about Judaism and the Hebrew people.
Yes. Oh, don't you get too far ahead of me, Mr. Shank. Before
Oh,
we
you.
begin,
Oh,
I have to
yes,
start
yes.
out with our
I'm
lovely
sorry.
catchphrase that hopefully our viewers have gotten used to at this point, or listeners. If you're listening to the audio, I'm sorry. There's probably going to be visual references, as this is our first video podcast show, I guess. But anyway, Temende Calsa es Nescire.
Now we may begin.
Yes.
All right. So, early history of the Hebrews. They started in a place northeast of Egypt. You know, in the last episode we were talking about Egypt. We're really just shifting our focus northeast to a land called Canaan. And this is the promised land, which we'll get to. But what do you think the square footage on that is?
Maybe square mileage. I would hate to try to figure out the square footage.
I'm thinking of a house.
I don't, so I've actually I've thought about this before because I'm not entirely, obviously I'm not sure, but I want to say Israel is like, it's one of the smaller countries I'm willing to, before I Google, all right, let's take bets before I Google this.
Okay.
Because I'm going to. I'm going to say, and I have absolutely no conception of space right now. I am going to say, God, I don't know. Maybe like, maybe something like 300 square miles. That seems small, but I'm.
Are you talking Israel? Or are you talking Canaan?
Well, no. So I'm talking Canaan.
Okay.
I'm gonna start with Israel and do some math here.
I'll say 500 square miles.
Okay. So, we're not even in the right. Just Israel alone's like 8,500. Let's note that we're not math teachers, right?
Yeah.
So finding the area is not our strong suit.
I
wonder though. Let's see if somebody's done the math on this. Square miles of Canaan. Canaan, Ohio. Canaan, Ohio is 33.24 square miles.
Canton?
No, Canaan. Oh no, wait, no, this is okay. There is a Canaan, Ohio. This is Canaan, Connecticut.
Oh,
it's right next to North Canaan, Connecticut. There's a Canaan, Maine, Canaan, New Hampshire, New York.
So there's
Indiana.
Lots of promised lands.
Right? The promised land is everywhere. Everywhere you want it to be. Let me specify. Let's try Middle East. If I can be like, yes, Canaan's located in the central eastern part of Connecticut. All right, let's see. Nothing.
Yeah, I'd be surprised.
Yeah, I mean that would be so, but you got to figure. So it's larger than Israel, but not a lot. It's like Israel,
5,000 square miles.
Well, Israel was 8,500, so I'm going to say probably 12, maybe 12,000.
Yeah, reverse.
Yeah, maybe 12. I would guess
12,000 square miles.
Dude, I said 300 to begin with. How much further off can I get? Like,
I was like, if this is Price is Right, I'm up on stage now.
That's true. I was measuring based on like how far I am from Virginia, and then how big I think Israel is.
Hoping you all over.
Yes, I missed the mark on that one, but yeah. So I would say with that in mind, I think 12,000 is probably a fair estimate. But on the global stage, Canaan's small.
It's very small. Yeah.
Let's all right, now here we go. I'm going to take Connecticut and see how big Connecticut is and use Connecticut as an example. Connecticut's what, our second smallest state? Rhode Island the smallest?
Rhode Island's the smallest. I know that.
I feel like Connecticut, I don't know. Maybe Connecticut's like, I don't know, what's the square mileage of Hawaii? in the islands that we count as states.
That is a good point.
Hmm.
I don't know.
How did we get on this topic? All right, so Connecticut is smaller than Israel. Connecticut is 5,543 square miles. So like 2.5 Connecticut's.
Yeah, yeah. I
That's
love
like
how
one.
that took us like
That's like one
3
Vermont.
minutes, 4 minutes to get that Canaan is the size of 2 Connecticut's.
Vermont is 9,000. So it's like 1.5 Vermonts.
1.5 Vermont.
And that I'm just basing that strictly off a number I don't even know is correct. So I don't even. Vermont is roughly the size of Israel. It's a little bit bigger.
That's fair. That's fair.
This is turning out wonderfully.
All right, let's get back on track. The area is also referred as, so is it, it's Levant or Levant? Not Levant, right?
Either is acceptable, just like Leonidas and Leonidas. No. Yeah, both are fine. No, I mean I've heard it pronounced as Levant more than Levant. I've just always said Levant, but I also say like aunt instead of aunt.
Yeah, I think I go Levant. But why is it called the Levant?
I don't know. They're referred to as the Levantine peoples, the people of the Levant. And well, okay, so it might, I don't know. I don't know what Levant translates to, because that region is also referred to in Arabic as Al-Shem. That's like ISIS is the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Shem. Not Syria, but it's basically the same general area. I don't know. Now etymological origin of Levant, which is the area of Western Asia. That was something that took a long time for me to come to terms with, the fact that like the Middle East, we always think of it as kind of a separate area. Yeah, that's Asia. We just do not think of it that way. So Levant, there you go. Levant appears in the English language 1497, means east, or basically east of Italy, from the French Levant, rising, referring to the sun rising in the east. So it's just the east. all of that to get back to, well, that's like when they referred to it as they used to refer to it as the Orient. Like the Far East was referred to as the Orient because it's based on the orientation of a compass. That's east. Therefore,
it's simple.
It is very. I thought it was going to be more complex. I'm a little bit let down
too.
at
I thought
this point.
More religious purpose behind it, but if it's just east, it's just east.
Yeah. Well, of course, the whole world has to center on the Mediterranean, and Europe, the false continent there. So
it is bizarre. But they're the crossroads of trade, being kind of on the eastern side of the Mediterranean or the Great Sea. And so they're going to have a lot of people rolling in and rolling out of that area for sure.
And I know we mentioned this in our Rome podcast, but it's worth noting that the Great Sea is probably what most people would have actually referred to the Mediterranean as, or maybe even just the sea. It gets the name Mediterranean now because it's in the middle of the terrain, in the middle of the land, and the Romans called it Mare Nostrum, or our sea, because why not, right? I guess
nobody else.
They did take it. So.
Fair. So let's get into the meat of the Hebrews. So we know we spent like 7 minutes talking about where they're located.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the people and their beliefs and religion and so forth. Abraham, not to be confused with Lincoln, this is a different Abraham, is considered the father of the Jews / the Hebrews, meaning that he basically founded this religion, and we look to him as starting it.
Mm-hmm. And the story essentially is that Yahweh, or God, basically appears to Abraham, who's at that point struggling to have a male heir. So this is the divide between Islam and Judaism. So he does have a child with Hagar, who is his wife's handmaid, technically, I think, if I'm not mistaken, at his wife's bidding, because he can't conceive a child with his wife, Sarah. And so he has a child with Hagar, which is Ishmael, who will go on to be kind of like the founder of the peoples that will become the Muslims, like the those particular tribes. And then he does have a child with Sarah, and that brings us to Isaac, who he is then asked to sacrifice. So Yahweh asks him to sacrifice his son as a um, uh, motion of dedication to Yahweh himself, right? So it's almost like, I have rewarded you with a son, and your descendants will number the stars. Now, show your devotion to me by sacrificing the only son that I gave you. And Abraham is prepared to do this, and the angel intervenes at the last moment and provides him with a ram stuck in the thorns in a thicket nearby to be sacrificed in Isaac's stead.
Poor ram. Poor ram.
Yes. Yeah, the guy was just trying to get to those berries, got his horn hooked, and sacrifice.
I think we talked about this before, but I've heard like different animals for it. But I think ram is probably the most noted one.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I've heard maybe sheep, ram, and there was another one too. I don't want to say a goat, but maybe.
Well, and right there, you're basically exemplifying the biggest problem with understanding anything here, is that everything that we know is primarily from the Old Testament, which is recorded some several hundred years after, well, thousands of years after the story of Abraham would have been taking place, but hundreds of years after the others. And so how much of that goes from its original form to some type of he said, she said, this is the story, it's become legend now, and we record it as legend. So it's the same problem you run into with a lot of the different faiths through the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's, nobody's walking around taking notes at the time.
And I think Abraham and Sarah, like I know they were old, but weren't they in their like 90s?
Yeah.
They were like ridiculously old.
Well, I mean, and everybody in the Old Testament lives to be into their, well, I shouldn't say everybody. Everybody in the first like half of the Old Testament, essentially, like the first like Genesis or so, like everybody lives to be into their hundreds, like 300 and 400 years old.
They were going by lunar years, though, right?
Yeah, I think that's the understanding, at least. But even then, you've got to think like that's the lunar year is like 12 to 1, 11 to 1, something like that. So even then, if you're living to be 300, like even back back then when the average age is not that old.
No.
But I think that's I don't even know that that's actually confirmed that. Yeah, so that's how we explain it, is they were going by lunar years. That does fit for
it shaved some years off, but like you said, not that many.
Yeah, not when some of them lived. I forget I want to say it was like Enoch was the oldest person.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm gonna have to Google it.
While you do that, I'll talk about, you already talked about the promise and the covenant with Yahweh. Yahweh is the Hebrew version of Hebrew name for God. My friend Mark says, I guess it depends on like what branch of Judaism you are, but he was like, we don't call him Yahweh, we just call him God.
Right. Well, and I think that has a lot more to do with just like Judaism is one of the more what's the word I'm looking for, like modernized of the Abrahamic faiths. Like it's like 75 to 80% of most Jews are some form of secularized. Like they're more like cultural Jew than actually religious. But I do know that the most of the time they'll say the word God, but to write it out on something that can be destroyed. So like if you were to ask them to write it on a piece of paper, they won't actually write the word God. They would write like the G and then like an asterisk in the D. Because to write the name of God on something that can be destroyed is unacceptable.
Yeah.
Methuselah was the oldest person, about 980 9 or maybe 7 something.
Methuselah?
Yeah, and I actually did know that because was it you that told me about the show Altered Carbon? Or
I
did
thought
I
you
tell you
told me
about it?
about it.
Maybe I told you about that. Yeah, I still haven't finished that. But right, the whole idea of like uploading your you-ness to clones of yourself, basically, they referred to the people that do that as Meths, as a reference back to Methuselah, who lived to be 900 and some years old. I remember that in like the second episode of the show, and it stuck until I just forgot it a minute ago.
That, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very early on in the show.
Well, what makes the Hebrews so important and so unique is they're the first people to accept only one God. And this is what we consider monotheism. You have one God that controls the entire universe. You know, in polytheism, you have multiple gods doing, you know, one, I don't say one task, but you have a god of fire, a god of war, a god of strength, whatever the god is, that's their particular skill set. But now you have this idea that God doesn't just reside over, and before they thought that God was like the Hebrew God, but like localized to Canaan, right? Like he's the God of Canaan.
Well,
That area.
I think Yahweh is one of several gods in that region that was locally worshipped, and then it kind of became asserted. You know, I'm the one God. Like the one that you and it's, you know, I mean, even if you look at like the construction of the Ten Commandments, it's not a statement that says there are no other gods. It's a statement that says you shall put no other gods before me. Right? I'm the most important one to focus on. So it's almost an acknowledgement of its time that yes, we understand that there's other gods that people worship,
but worship me.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So Abraham's grandson Jacob, also known as Israel, had 12 sons, and that's when we were talking about Israel, where they get the name from. The basis for the 12 tribes of Israel, from whom all Jewish are descended from.
I think they actually in Hebrew they differentiate between the Israel of the Bible and Israel as the homeland. As I know the land, at least the territory of Israel, is called Eretz Yitzrael, and that's the land of Israel. So when they're referring to what is today the country of Israel, they refer to that as either Zion, which is quite popular, but or Eretz Yitzrael is the I don't know if that's actually Hebrew. I think it might be, but that was from I read a book by a guy named Ari Shavit, he's a journalist, but the book was called My Promised Land, where he like returned to Israel and was talking about all the issues there today, the current issues, and how it plays into the past. It was very good. It's probably somewhere in my vast library behind me. No, I'm sure it's in one of the boxes over there somewhere.
Library of Alexandria, and
it feels that way.
Basement.
If only.
The next portion we'll talk about is the migration. These Hebrews, just throughout their history, are going to migrate from different portions of the world for different reasons. But their original migration here was from Canaan. So they're living in Canaan, and, you know, God or Yahweh and Hebrew people have this covenant together, and they're prospering for a while. I think it's like 150 years that they're doing pretty well there in Canaan, but drought ends up forcing them to move to this place called Egypt, which we talked about in the last episode, because Egypt was thriving. Egypt was essentially bumping. And so they're initially accepted there, but over time, the Hebrews were enslaved by the Egyptians. And I think for like a couple generations they were enslaved. It wasn't just one generation or so. I think it was like, I want to say like 400 years. That's what popped in my head.
So I'm going to hit you with a timeline here from my book that you can't see. Movie magic. All right. So Abraham. I was going to find a way to cite this, but I don't really know that I can. It's Rose Publishing Company is the only thing I know for a fact. So according to this, you're looking at like biblical Abraham is like 2100 BC, roughly. It's almost 2200 BC. So there's this long period there, and then when you have Joseph, who's mentioned here, and that's the same Joseph of the story of like the Technicolor dream coat, the coat of dreams and such. So that's Joseph is like 1900 BC. He becomes an official in Egypt, and if you're familiar with that story, it's it's actually quite interesting. But so he becomes an official in Egypt, and that's where the sort of outcomes from for the Hebrew people who are suffering in Canaan. It's like, oh well, okay, so Joseph is this. He's a well-respected official in the Egyptian government, and the Egyptian government has agreed to have us here. And so they kind of migrate to Egypt, and this would have been, if you're thinking timeline wise, and they're coming in, somewhere in that 1800s period, 1900s period BC. That is right at about the fall of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, roughly. So it's sort of around the Hyksos invasion. So then you end up with the slavery period in Egypt somewhere at the tail end of like 1600 BC. And that lasts for, so according to this, so this is dates uncertain, basically, but they have the, so Moses is 120 years old. So they, no, so essentially, based on this, at least the period of slavery in Egypt is like 140 years, roughly. But in lunar years, you're looking at several hundred years. So that could be the distinction that's made there. And I actually looked, knowing that we were coming up on this episode, I looked into this a little bit because as we'll get, actually, I'll wait till we get there. I'm not going to jump too far ahead. But yeah, so the purpose of going to Egypt, and I mean, this world is connected anyway. We shouldn't make any assumptions that it's like traveling to a completely foreign land. They would have been traded and interacting, and the Egyptians conquered that land and were conquered by people from that land. So that's there was a trade with them, all of that. So there's a relationship between the Middle East and what would be Mesopotamia region and Egypt. They're all very interconnected. So the fact that they would see Egypt as an option, especially knowing somebody in the government, is not at all out of the ordinary.
Yeah, for sure. So eventually, they're in captivity, they're enslaved, and somebody they may be familiar with is the name of Moses. He was the man who would lead the Hebrews out of Egypt and back to the promised land. Maybe you've seen, what's the movie? Prince of Egypt?
Yeah, Prince of Egypt.
Prince of Egypt, the Disney one, where he essentially is, thrown down a river in a basket at an early age so he could be saved. It's all I think like everyone between 2 and younger were all being executed in the Hebrews, and it floated on down the river, and the royal family picked it up and raised with Ramses. If Ramses was the pharaoh at the time.
Well, and that's what I was actually about to talk about. So I so well restrained myself. So I actually looked into this because anytime I had ever seen, and this timeline is another example, anytime you ever see the kind of the timeline of the Exodus laid over top of a timeline of Egypt, it doesn't quite line up that Ramesses would have been the pharaoh at that time. It just doesn't quite match. I was reading an article from, I think it was Encyclopedia Britannica, actually, and they were talking about how that had not necessarily been adjusted for. It was something like the Hebrews measured in generations, but that had not been adjusted for what we consider a generation to what they would have considered a generation. So their generation of like 25 years, we tend to think of it as a longer period. So when you make the adjustment for that, it puts Ramses right there. So it's entirely possible. Like, and then if you look at like just the concept of treatment, like his father Seti was pretty harsh to the Hebrews in general, but to all of Egypt. He was a very stern ruler, and then that translates pretty well into the time period that Ramses would rule. So, and of course the war Ramses has with the Hittite kingdoms. It all just kind of did seem to make more sense to me once I started. I'm fairly certain that was Encyclopedia Britannica that I
So
was
more
reading
than
that.
likely, Moses was living and ruling at the time of Ramses. Wait, sorry, I had that backwards.
Well, and it's sort of accurate, right? If he was in
Yeah,
fact raised in the royal house, although I think the concept that Prince of Egypt plays with them being brothers, I think that was, I think he was like supposed to have been found by the sister maybe and
that's what I
raised
thought
within
too.
the
Yeah,
house. I don't, I haven't read through that in a long time, but I think it was the sister. Uh, but anyway.
yeah. So he's born to the royal family. Eventually, discovers his true heritage that he is a Hebrew, and I don't know if he actually does. I don't know if it's an embellishment of that. That he kills a guard and has to flee, and he leaves, Egypt, and that's when he kind of discovers who he is, and he comes back, and he's going to lead the Hebrew people out of slavery, and they've been enslaved for generations and generations, and this is known as the Exodus. Think of it like a giant portion, well, not giant portion at all, like a big, massive amount of people leaving an area all at once. That's like what I envision, like an exodus. Like you could say, like schools, when the bell rings at the end of the day, that's an exodus.
Absolutely.
So, then this is where the 10 plagues come in. This is where like Passover comes in. And eventually, Moses is able to convince Ramses to let his people go. And whether or not he actually said that, I don't know, but that's
Right.
kind of played up by Hollywood and so forth. And Ramses, if the plagues were all those 10 plagues, the last one would have been firstborn son is kills over, and so Ramses lets him go, but then he kind of has like a change of heart and chases Ramses. Ramses chases the Hebrews down, and they're not at the Red Sea. Do you remember what sea it was?
It's like an estuary of the Red Sea. It's like
Yeah,
I forget what that's,
this
but
is
it's
where like
the narrow portion that cuts between the Sinai and the Arabian Peninsula.
yeah, and
I can't think of the name of it.
the story is that he, raises the Red Sea. Even though we know it's not the Red Sea, the Hebrews go through. We're talking thousands of Hebrews, and they're all through. And then once they're all through, Ramses and well, probably just his soldiers and so forth are taking this pathway between raised water on each side, and boom, it's let down by Moses with the aid of Yahweh to kind of showcase the power. And then they take their journey after that, the Hebrews, back to Canaan. But the journey isn't just a couple hundred miles and you're there. They kind of go down the Sinai Peninsula, and they're trapped in the desert for 40 years. But during this time, during the early maybe days, weeks, eventually they reach whatever it is, Mount Sinai. I don't know what point they reach Mount Sinai, but Moses goes to the top of Mount Sinai and gets the Jews' sacred code, which is the 10 Commandments. So he's up there for 40 days, Moses is, and 40 nights. And he comes down with 2 tablets written on, but he's up there, no communication. They're not like texting Moses saying, hey, you're going to be down here any moment. When are you getting back? And so he comes down and he sees that all these, Hebrews who were freed by Yahweh, all these, the plagues, what the locust and the water turning into blood, the first, all these different crazy plagues that came about and that got them out of slavery, they went and they started worshiping a golden calf. They melted down all the gold they could kind of gather from people, melted it down, and started worshiping a golden calf. And Moses saw this and was like, "Are you kidding me?" And just, I think he threw, well, the story has it that he either threw one or both down and they broke. I think one at least broke. I mean, yeah, I'd be pretty upset too
Yeah.
if you went through all that agony and led people out. You literally, if the story's true, you move the sea, split it in two. Obviously, Yahweh's on your side. Like, wait more, wait as long as you need to wait.
Yeah.
But that's just the renewal of the covenant with
Mm.
Abraham. So it's like the second covenant, this sacred code. So the first covenant was when Abraham and Yahweh agreed that, hey, if you move the Hebrew people to Canaan, you'll prosper and your descendants will number the stars. But the second one is kind of renewing that covenant by going back to Canaan and taking these 10 commandments to guide the Hebrew people.
And just as an aside, I remember watching this documentary several years ago now, and I've been very unsuccessful in finding the one that I watched. But there are others that I've seen, and there's actually a book called Parting the Sea. I don't remember who wrote it. But it's all based off of the fact that this and all the plagues supposedly could be explained geologically or with volcanology based on the eruption of Santorini in Greece. So that things like the shifting of the seas could be associated with that. The disruption of the plates leading to a earth gas leaking, like methane gases leaking, which could lead to the death of the firstborn child, because in Egyptian culture, your firstborn child slept like as close to the floor as possible. And then the elder children were usually suspended in like hammocks, but the firstborn child had an actual bed, uh, like right up against the floor. So being the lowest to the ground, that gas, if it was in fact leaking, would have suffocated anything low on the ground. So like the firstborn children. But there were several others, like the volcanic eruption would have, the fire falling from the sky and having like animals disrupted, so like the toads coming out of the sea, the water's turning red like blood. The argument is that could have all been explained geologically and just happened to fit this time period.
Yeah, I remember that documentary, but this is like, you're talking like 15
I
plus
was
years.
gonna say it's a lot. I think I might have still been in high school.
Yeah. I remember
How
being
many
really
years
good
ago that would
and
be.
just like having a nice perspective, a different perspective like
Hmm.
that. And like you said, making it all geological.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's been like 15 years.
Yeah, that's probably pretty close. Yeah, I'll have to still continue my quest to find it, but I'll find there's a book that I know was written about that too.
Yeah. But eventually Moses, he never actually gets to the promised land, but the
Right.
Hebrews actually do.
Hmm.
And there's basically these huge 12 tribes, Judah being like the largest one. That's where we get Judaism from.
Hmm.
And they're going back to Canaan. But this is what I tell my students, that they've been gone for hundreds of years, right?
Hmm.
To them, Canaan is the promised land. But just because it's the promised land to them doesn't mean that other people won't want to live there. And it's not like they came back and they said, all right, well, it's completely empty. No one's living here anymore. We don't have to fight. Like, no, there are people living there, Philistines being one of the main ones. You're going to have to fight them. You're going to have to get the promised land back by force. You're not
Hmm.
going to say, hey, can you politely leave? Yahweh said it's the promised land for us forever, and there's no expiration date on this. So can you just exit? Can you do an exodus? So
Yeah.
it's not going to work. They're going to have to fight. So, and that's what Saul, the first king, isn't. He's more known for, like, I won't say combat king, but it's kind of a nice alliteration. Combat king.
It is a nice
I don't know if
alliteration.
I've ever heard that, but yeah.
Yeah, and so it's worth noting, like, this is a good chunk of time later too. Like, there's this whole period of like the rule of the tribes and the judges and the combat that's going on, and then you kind of have this starting to be organized, and that's where you do have Saul who starts like the United Kingdom of Israel against the kind of identified states of Canaanite tribes like the Philistines. Um, but yeah, so Saul's, yeah, like you said, the combat king, the one who kind of unites the different tribes of Israel together, and then he falls out of favor um, with Yahweh, and that's where you have David, the David and Goliath story, which is essentially how David proves his value as a leader, and then will be anointed king of the Hebrews after.
How tall was Goliath?
Yeah, so like the name itself, we associate with like
Huge.
monstrosity. Yeah, like, I mean, I think I recall reading somewhere about like there's like evidence that the Philistines themselves were just like a warrior group of people, so they're naturally larger. They kind of select themselves for that, so to speak. But then Goliath is supposed to be the biggest of all of them. So I mean, if we're going to be kind of like reasonable in terms of, I mean, he's not a 12-foot tall dude walking around, but I would say like in this time period, average height is probably something like, I don't even know what it is today. I feel like it's like 5'8" or 5'9" today.
Are you talking the world, or are you talking like?
Yeah, I'm talking worldwide. I feel like
Yeah,
it's,
probably that. I think the U.S. is like 5'10", 5'11".
yeah.
A lot of
So
yeah.
let's even work from that. Let's say like 5'11", just because I want to feel at least slightly above average. So let's say like 5'11" is the average height. So David's young. So he's probably not even that, right? You're probably looking at a guy who's like 5'6", 5'7". Uh, Goliath is maybe it's like 6'8", right? So I mean, he's standing a head taller easily,
Mm-hmm.
and that's enough to intimidate anybody. If you've never run into somebody that's just bigger, stronger, and taller than you, I mean, that's, if you're bigger, stronger, and taller than your contemporaries, that's you're going to have that almost that bully factor to begin with.
Yeah.
Let's see what the internet has to say about Goliath's size now. Now I'm
I
interested.
heard up to 8 feet tall.
Well, I heard he was.
Seriously though, might be. Who knows? Could be 12 feet tall for all we know. Yeah, but 6'8" probably makes the most sense though.
I mean, just that's just in comparison to if we put David to be, that height. But I mean, he is supposed to be a giant, and that's not entirely out of possibility, right? Because we've had real people who were like gigantic. I think I
Yeah,
was the world's tallest man was something like upwards of like 9 feet or something.
I want to say yeah. I think
Might be more than that. I don't know. So this puts Goliath over 9.5 feet tall,
yeah.
because he's described as 6 cubits and a span. A cubit is 18 inches and a span is 9. So 6 18-inch plus 9. So that's
Yes, that's pretty normal.
pretty large fellow there. Maybe
I
you
was
could recruit
close with
him
8 feet.
for the KGMS basketball team this season.
Just got to throw it up there. But this is where we get like in sporting events and so forth. They kind of like, you have commentators say like it's a David versus Goliath matchup,
Mhm.
meaning like a stronger, better opponent that's supposed to win, and the other one, which would be Goliath, and then the other
Mhm.
one being the David, being the one that is smaller, maybe weaker, doesn't have a much of a chance to win. So
Mhm. The one
uh,
everyone's betting against,
exactly, yeah, yeah.
it's the underdog.
Yeah, it's like the original underdog story. And moving on from David, and he was, I mean, not only that, but he was like a good administrative king. Something else. What else did he do?
I think he got into some trouble with the women. Isn't that how he fell out of favor?
I think so,
Um,
yeah.
I could be
And then
wrong.
came Solomon, and Solomon was known as the wise king. He was. I always kind of bring up the story with the baby and the two moms,
Yes.
where the one mom, they both have boys. I think they're neighbors, and we'll say 1 year old, and basically they look the same. And the one mom, the son dies, and she's devastated, and she steals her neighbor's son. It's like, oh, well, my son died, I'm gonna steal this one.
Hmm.
Well, obviously they both want the baby. The original mom, actually wants it because it's her baby, and they take it to Solomon. And at this time, kind of your king is kind of your, I guess, judge, jury, and executioner. And you have to think what you would do in this time. How would you solve this problem? How would you, they don't, you're not going to do a like a Maury Povich show here where you're the
Yeah.
father or you're the
Yeah. There's
mother.
no DNA testing.
There's no DNA test. So, you can, a lot of kids say, well, why don't you just ask her? Well, the one lady's lying, right? And
Right.
maybe she's a good liar. And you don't really know. And you don't want to just say, okay, I'll just give it to you.
Yeah, I mean, you
Pretty
can't base
sure.
it on, you can't even base it on evidence of, oh, well, this other person said, she did take her baby. Well, like how well can you trust the common people? Like, I mean, not that you shouldn't, and I'm not advocating for authoritarianism, but I'm saying, like, you know, uh, you're talking about what is this, like early Iron Age peasants in the Middle East. Like, how well do you trust them to look out for the well-being of their neighbor every time?
Yeah.
So
And you couldn't say, oh, look, the baby looks like me. They might both have, they already did look like each other, the babies. Um, but what Solomon does is that he decides to, okay, well, you'll both get a half. Half of the baby will go to one mom, the other half will go to the other. Now, I don't believe Solomon was obviously going to do this. Not going to cut the baby in half because you don't know if you cut a baby in half, the baby will not survive. So what he determined is that who the real mom, would say, no, 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 don't hurt my baby. Let her have it. They would rather see their own child in another person's arms and raise them than have their baby die. And that's when that emotion came out.
mhm.
And Solomon was able to pinpoint what or who was the real mother. And just one, like, I mean, he has more stories than that, but that's always one that always resonated me with. Just like the wisdom that he had. And
Mhm.
he obviously will build, even though there was a temple there, he'll make it much grander in scale. Solomon's temple. And this is where the Ark of the Covenant
Mhm.
is held. And inside that Ark, this is where you have the Ten Commandments, where the word of Yahweh, the word of God, is housed in this golden container called the Ark of the Covenant inside this luxurious, fortified temple. If you want to take how that temple goes through its ups and downs, Mr. Woods.
Yeah, well, it's I mean, it certainly is that. So actually, I believe that according to tradition, there's a little bit of that temple remaining today in Israel. So like Mr. Shank was saying, it's not the first incarnation of that temple. Um, there was a temple standing in that area beforehand, so it's not entirely um, unreasonable that you're going to construct a new temple there, and it's not unlikely at all that um, that Solomon would have done this as a housing location for what is essentially at this point the most sacred artifacts for the Hebrew people, right? Like the word of God inscribed in stone, or essentially what's left of it. And so you're going to want a place house this, and of course you're going to build this, this as grand a temple as you can get. Now, so this temple, it's not going to, well, Jerusalem itself has some rough years throughout history. It's sacked several times, but the particular temple that is constructed by Solomon is destroyed in the 6th century BC. I believe so. Anyway, and it depends on the. Yes, it depends on your understanding of what happened. So there's some stories that say that the Ark of the Covenant was smuggled away before this kind of temple is destroyed. There's other stories that say, perhaps the Ark of the Covenant was captured as the temple was destroyed, and others that maybe it was just completely left in the wreckage. But that's sort of one of the, I wouldn't say the first time Jerusalem was attacked, because I do believe that there's I mean, the city was there before David made it the capital of the Hebrew people, so it probably underwent warfare at some other point in history. But anyway, circling back to this, when the temple is actually destroyed in the 500s, that's by Nebuchadnezzar the second, who is the king of the Neo-Babylonians, Chaldeans. We should invent our own names for some of these. It's like I was teaching AP history yesterday, and like this one Native American's chief name comes up, and the kid's like, "How do you pronounce it?" I was like, "I'm not going to do him the dishonor of me butchering his name. I'm not even going to try. I can say Wengapo." And that's about the extent of my. I think that's actually in Pocahontas. I think Wengapo is. My wife pointed that out whenever we started talking. Yeah, I think that's like when she says hello to Grandmother Willow, and she says like Wengapo. And that's. So I'm wondering how much of his understanding is legit and how much of it's based off Disney. Now I'm starting to question, because it's the
Disney.
Biological similarities aren't there. So.
Yeah, no.
And especially when he calls you out after the illustration of is that your great grandfather or something like that?
Yeah.
What is this?
Yeah, I forgot we had this. They kind of Saul, David, and Solomon a bit more helpful, but
take it from the top.
Yeah, Saul. Just a quick recap. Saul, the first king of Israel, famous for pushing the Philistines out of key areas. Then we have David. David united the tribes of Israel together, made the city of Jerusalem their capital. Solomon, famous for the creation of Jerusalem's first temple, like we talked about, Solomon's temple, where the Ark of the Covenant is inside. And he's known for being fair, just, wise, all of the above. The end of the Hebrew kingdom.
Yeah, it seems like we just started talking about the beginning of the Hebrew
and
kingdom.
Now it's the end.
Yes. Of course, this is a good chunk of time, too.
Yeah.
Over 1,000 years.
It's casual 1,000.
Yeah.
Disagreements broke out between the tribes, resulting in this division. You've got 10 northern tribes known as Israel, and you've got 2 southern tribes known as Judah. So,
and that division actually, that division actually kind of sticks through even post Hebrew kingdom history. There's like a clear distinction between the 2 regions, even in the time of Roman occupation. The Romans referred to all of it as Judea. But there was kind of this mindset that the people from the northern half of this, like up in the regions of Galilee, they were more like I don't know, like shepherds or like hill folk type of thing. And then the further south you got, the closer to the Dead Sea you got, and the closer to Egypt really that you got, the more cosmopolitan it became, like the more interconnected and global the cities. I mean, that's where Jerusalem is. That's where some of these larger cities are. Even like older, larger cities are located in this region, so you get that kind of more urban feeling the further south you go.
Mm-hmm. And eventually, they're going to be attacked by the Assyrians. They'll be forced to pay tribute. Both of these, Israel and Judah. It's also interesting too that like almost like every religion, they're gonna split in some way, and
Mm-hmm.
typically it's like something. I'm not saying something minor, but like it's something that seems, at least from an outside perspective, like seems trivial.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm not inundated into it, so I don't know. And as you
Right.
said before, eventually they're going to be overtaken by the Chaldean king Nebuchadnezzar II, which we will talk about him in the next episode when we talk about Mesopotamia.
Mm.
But they'll be enslaved again. So the Hebrews have really had it pretty harsh here. They're either being enslaved or they're fighting for their land, they're fighting for whatever, but they just seem to can't catch a break.
Mm.
And they'll be enslaved in the city of Babylon. This will be known as the exile or the Babylonian captivity. I think they're there like 100 years, maybe. I think they're not there as long as they were in Egypt, but
No, no, no. But it's. I mean, it's long enough that, that people have basically given up on. I mean, that kind of sort of became and that almost kind of carries through, like the mentality of the Hebrews, that it's almost like I don't want to throw out there that it's like a victimization complex, but like even when you look at, because that would be awful to put it that
yeah,
way. That's going to be the part of this video that gets clipped and shared. But I mean, when you think about, like, take the events surrounding the Holocaust, for example, like when that process started, there's newspaper articles you can find from Jewish magazines in Germany in like the late 30s. As rights are being restricted for Jewish people in Germany, and people are starting to flee Germany, and there's Jewish, basically journalists, writing essentially op-eds going, well, it's bad, but it's not that bad. We'll be okay. This isn't going to happen. It's not going to be, we don't have to worry. Sure, there's restrictions, but Germany's recovering, so we'll make it through this. And clearly, from the get-go, we know now, like this, like Hitler's plan was never to. It was get the Jewish people out.
yeah,
However you got to do it, move them out. That doesn't work, off them. I mean, it was never going to be a situation of compromise. And we know, of course, we have a different perspective, right? We're looking back on this and can know that looking at the story. And I'm sure it was much different to be living, as a Jewish person living in 1930s Europe. But that sort of mentality of, well, we can't do anything about it, so we just kind of have to, let's just kind of carry on. Um, you see that during the period of Egypt, because the Hebrew people are very resistant to this idea of, what do you mean we're going to leave Egypt? This is our status quo. We're stuck here. And kind of you see that same thing. There are Jewish elders that do not want to leave the period of captivity in Babylon. I mean, some do once they're liberated. You have like Zerubbabel, the future king of the Hebrew people. Like he will lead people back, or start leading them back to Canaan. But not everybody goes. Some choose to stay, and it's kind of that same. At least for me, like the through line there is kind of that. Well, we can't change the situation we've been handed. We just have to try and make the best of it.
yeah, yeah. On that journey to Babylon, and I think even there too as well, that
Mm.
the rabbis are going to write down the Hebrew history, because I think they kind of realize that, yeah, like you said, the idea of Canaan is it's I kind of think of it like the Ragnarok movie. I think it is. The people. It's like not a place; it's a people, and that's
Yes.
kind of what I think of with the Hebrews. I guess you don't have to be in one location, and that's kind of, they'll have that diaspora kind of throughout their entire history at different points. But they wrote down, their Hebrew history on this Jewish sacred text is known as the Torah, and this is kind of, you know not all, but like think of like the Old Testament, if that helps you. And eventually the Chaldeans will be overthrown by the Persians, another people we will talk about in the next episode. And the Persian king Cyrus the Great, he's like Cyrus the Savior in the Old Testament. You know, there's a lot of good things written about him because
Yeah, he's very popular.
yeah, I mean, rightfully so. It's a kind of, you know what, it was really interesting when I was listening to Mike Tyson and Joe Rogan. Mike Tyson is huge into ancient history since he was 15, and he was
Really?
talking about Cyrus the Great, and he was just saying like, how crazy is it that, you know, he wanted to have like basically freedom of religion. You know, he wanted and freed these Hebrews, and yeah, I didn't think that Mike Tyson would know all that information.
Of all the people, you know, he would.
He said that he wanted to study the fight, like the great leaders and so forth, and like if he could pick up anything. He said he learned so much and made him a better fighter. So I mean, there's ways that history can help us that we don't understand or we do understand, but it's definitely useful.
Well, I always find that with the Persians, you know, even more interesting because the Persians really were, for most of their history, a very very ahead of their time group of people. I mean,
Hmm.
or you know, you can look at it and say and find bad things. You can do that anywhere, but you know, when you take into the big things like as far as technological and like government organizational advances, they're ahead of the game. Establishing a currency, you know, an infrastructure. You tack freedom of religion onto that, and you take Cyrus just as kind of the example of a guy who literally pulls himself up from nothing to build this empire. You know what I mean? Like he did not inherit that empire, and so he's um, a very interesting figure for that. And you know, like you said, as he's going through conquering people, you know, he takes out the Chaldeans or the Chaldeans, and then you know he sees the enslavement of the Hebrews, and there's not slavery in the Persian Empire, so he's not going to take them on as slaves. And so you know if you don't want to be here, go home.
Yeah.
You know you're free at this point. I do your thing. You know, like that. To you imagine the Hebrews of all people, like they've basically been fighting their entire lives for essentially, you know, legitimization that they even exist as a separate people, let alone a homeland, let alone freedom on top of all of that. And this guy just shows up. What do you mean you're not free? Yeah, go home. Like you know, like
Yeah,
that
it's
mindset is just
way ahead of
yeah.
their time.
And to your point with the Torah, so the Torah is the initial 5 books. So this is uh, essentially it's you know the bulk history of the Hebrew people from creation to you know sort of laying down. I wouldn't say law codes, guidelines, moral codes, because the you know the actual law comes later. So this is 5 books. And you know that's how it's divided chapters you could say, but you're still you know of an average Bible you're probably looking at 300 pages of the text there that makes up this section. That's still, I mean, it's called the Mosaic text. It's the story of Moses essentially, among other things, but the texts themselves, this is the bulk. I mean, there's a lot more. There's 38 39 books in the Old Testament itself. So these first 5 are considered the most important though, of all of them. So there's like the Torah. I think there's the the Nevinim and Ketuvium are the other. Probably pronouncing that wrong, but they're the other 2 like sections of books. It's like teachings, and I don't remember what the other one translates to. One's the teachings, but something like that. Now I have to Google it.
Yeah. How dare you? How dare you?
I'm getting rusty, man.
That happens. Um, and then, like
Oh,
I
I
said,
was wrong. It wasn't teachings. Oh yeah, no, the Torah is teachings. The Nevium is prophets, and Ketuvium is writings. I guess.
yeah,
Yeah, but that's
sure.
like the three chunks of it. Anyway, way more than you need to know.
That's what this is for.
I mean, we did have the first however many minutes discussing the square mileage of random U.S. states and Canaan.
And then eventually the Jews are going to become scattered throughout, into this day, the world. Most of the Jews on this planet live in, Israel and, Canaan, essentially.
I think the United States has like the second highest
I was going to say
population.
United States has the second most. Yeah. I want to say, I don't know the third off the top of my head, but it's somewhere like, I want to say South America, but I don't know.
It wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
I'm gonna sprinkle in how this fits into like later history, just very briefly, with the concept of Zionism, which is not a part of this. And if we continue this show the way I'd like to, at some point we'll get there. But this is a long ways down the road, I guess. So, like, as you know, this diaspora is basically occurring somewhere in like the 900s, 800s BC, and so then beyond that, the Hebrew people don't even actually fully conglomerate into even mediocre sized groups of people forever. They do scatter throughout Europe, and France is actually one of the early kind of Zionist efforts. You have something called the Dreyfus Affair, which was this. I think it was a French military officer. Was I want to say that there was an issue with him. I don't know if he like lost. It's something with his command. Anyway, so the newspaper article is drafted about this, and where it sort of basically accuses the French government, the French military, of anti-Semitism. And so this turns into a whole thing, and that's where you kind of see the development of the Zionist movement in that period. That's never really brought to any kind of fruition. Like, they start to kind of purchase some land from Palestinian groups in the Middle East, and there's somewhat of a legitimate quest to build a state there, and then that kind of falls away for a while. Then you have World War One, and essentially the Palestinian groups are promised territory during World War One that is never delivered. Right? They kind of unite to help tear apart the Ottoman Empire, and then the British sort of, well, we're gonna take care of this land for you. The Mandate of Palestine is created, the British Mandate, which was basically the colonization process of that whole region. Because the British, that's what they do. But then, so of course, that land isn't actually returned to the Palestinian people, and the British start getting in on this, kind of shuffling some of that land to the kind of next wave of Jewish immigrants, basically selling off land, or forcing the selling off of land. From Palestinian, essentially farmers, to these wealthy Jewish investors coming over and buying up chunks of territory, or organizations coming and buying up large chunks of land to basically try and purchase enough land to build a state in the region. And then, as that starts to gain traction, you're building toward World War II. And as you start to get into that period, like I said, like Hitler, initially his program was get all of the Jewish people out of any land that we lay any type of claim to. But there's nowhere for them to go. People didn't want them in their country, and a whole ship of Jewish refugees essentially was turned away from the United States. And they went to, like, I forget, they went to somewhere in South or Central America first, and were turned away. Went to the United States, were turned away. Canada, turned away, and they basically got sent back to Europe, and some of them ended up in Poland and were executed because they were denied harbor or anywhere else. And so of course that's one of my immigration points that I that I always hit. Like, how, when you're looking at a situation like that, how can you say no? You know what's happening, and everybody knew what was happening to some degree. But after World War II does come to a conclusion, the mindset then becomes, look, we can never again. We can never let something like this happen again. So we are going to formally establish the state of Israel. And so that's when, I think, 46 Israel, or 47 maybe, Israel is actually created out of that land, and basically just take land from everywhere else that we can, from all these other people, give it up. It's not yours anymore. This is all now used to form the state of Israel. So, it's definitely, you look at the peoples who have been living in that region ever since the Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. They have essentially been the same hereditary groups living there for over 1,000 years, and now it's, sorry, you're out of luck because the Hebrews need a place to go. But at the same time, it's one of those situations where what do you do? Like, you can't say that they don't deserve a place of their own, because everybody does, and this is their ancestral home. But yes, it is also your ancestral home at this point. What do you do? And that's what, I think the most viable solution I've seen to the conflict, which still goes on there, right, was the idea of a two-state solution. Basically, chunk two, cut it into, give half to each. Of course, nobody'd be satisfied with that. The other one I saw was just like a multi-state solution. So you have one state where half of the government is in the hands of one group and half is in the hands of the other, to start off with. And then you have elections, and you do this fairly. A certain amount, at least a minority of one party or the other, always has to have some type of veto power, and kind of seesaw that back and forth. I think that's the one that would actually be the most likely to happen. I don't know that it would actually work, right? Giving them each their own country would be the most logical thing, but you can't give everybody the Holy Lands that they want because they're the same place, So unfortunately, that's probably I think, if I could dig up the book, I think that author, hold on, talk about something, because I know I quoted it in a paper I wrote. But he ends with a very good sentiment on that. I have to find it
now. Like you just famous Jews we could talk about, with Gal Gadot, which means Wonder Woman. Adam Sandler, another one. Seth Rogen, Albert Einstein, right? I believe
so. Seth Rogen always surprises people, and I don't quite know why. I don't see that one as being surprising.
I don't know why that surprises people.
Not only does he kind of fit the stereotype that you associate with that, but I mean, he's pretty outspoken about being Jewish.
He is. Yeah, he did the movie I saw, The American Pickle, the recent one.
Yeah, I haven't seen that.
He plays two characters, his like great granddad or something like that, and him in like the 21st century, and basically he's pickled. His great grandfather, whatever it is pickled, and 100 years later he is unpickled, and because he worked in a pickle factory. But it was like obviously like an unbelievable premise in that, but it didn't really matter because like the rest of it was like kind of like just like a sweet story, I guess. It's not like a huge comedy by any means, but it's just like an interesting thing of like valuing your ancestors and valuing, what they've done, the hard work they put in to establish their name. And that's kind of like what he made a point of it early on, is like his character being the great grandfather is like, we're gonna, basically go from nothing, go to America and make something of ourselves. We won't have the best jobs, but our great grandkids or whatever will be doctors and lawyers and things like that. So,
do you remember? I don't know. You might be too old for this, Mr. Shank. But do you remember the Rugrats cartoon?
Yeah.
Okay, so the Rugrats is a Jewish family.
I guess they are. Yeah.
There's a whole section where they're celebrating it might be even a couple episodes where they're celebrating Passover.
I did not. That literally passed me over. I didn't even know that until you said that, and like I put all the pieces together there in like a split second. I'm like, yeah.
What reminded me was Pickle, right? Because I think their last name is Pickles.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
So remember how I said that was an uplifting quote, or kind of like a good sentiment? It's not that good of a sentiment, actually. But so the guy's name is Ari Shavet. He is and I'll give him his credit. He's a Jewish journalist, like an investigative journalist. So his conclusion, basically, at the end of this book, he draws the conclusion of there was hope for peace referring to in Israel. There was hope for peace, but there will be no peace here, not soon. There was hope for quiet, but there will be no quiet here, not in this generation. And I mean, he hasn't been wrong. That was in 2013 that book was written. But if you're interested, reputable bookstores near you, My Promise to Land from New York Press by Ari Shaw.
All right. Well, I think that's a good way to end it.
Yeah. Not in this generation.
This has been In the Back Room. I'm Mr. Shank.
And I'm Mr. Woods.
And the cause of fear is ignorance. All right. Have a good night. Bye.
Bye.
All right. I can stop sharing. And I will stop recording.